I might jump straight in and start with what led to US intervention into Vietnam. Vietnam has a long history of colonial rule and intervention from foreign powers, and with it has come a long legacy of resistance against it. Vietnam was first colonized by the French in 1883. This was a brutal occupation which led to, in 1941, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh being established, which would become the main opposition to it at the time. The French continued to rule until 1945, when Japan formally took over, and Japanese rule caused a famine that saw the death of 1 million people in North Vietnam. And this created a bit of a political vacuum for the rise of the Viet Minh, which was the communist independence fighters. And in 1945, that same year, they won power in Saigon, Hanoi, and across the country. After this, there was a continued struggle to regain control by the French alongside Britain and Japan. But it was in 1949, when Mao's Communist Party won power in China, that the US takes an interest in Vietnam. In a Cold War with the Soviet Union, the US see the so-called communist revolution in China as another victory for their imperialist rival, and the kind of capitalist system that they need for their corporations to make money is being threatened globally. Meanwhile, in Asia, there's a range of national liberation struggles and insurgencies. The US is worried about their potential weakening as a global power and saw Vietnam as an opportunity to establish Western power in the region. In response to this, we saw the US increase its economic and military support for the French. But within this, the Vietnamese resistance remained strong, and in 1954, the French were defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Vietnam gets split into two countries. You've got North Vietnam, which is run by the communists, and then South Vietnam, which is allied to the United States. And South Vietnam was ruled under the oppressive Diem regime, and out of that emerged the National Liberation Front. As per the division agreement, it was agreed that they would that the division would not be permanent, and the election would be held in 1956 for reunification. But in mid-1955, the Diem, with US encouragement, announced that the elections would not be held because they could see that they were going to lose. And then in 1959, there was an insurrection in the South, and the region continued to destabilize. In 1960, Kennedy sent the first American troops to Vietnam, and by the end of the year, there was 3,200 troops there. The resistance was winning, so American intervention continued to escalate. So the story of how the war ended is a story of struggle from below. The struggle emerged in three key places. Firstly was the continued fight for self-determination by the Vietnamese resistance. The second was the anti-war movement in the US, which included both students and veterans. And the third was the struggle within the armed forces, both in Vietnam and the military bases in the US. These three areas of struggle came together to legitimize and inspire each other, and the mass dissent over the war culminated in a crisis for the US where they were forced to end the war. The movement against the war began on university campuses, where there was space for debate and challenging ideas. Students became quickly radicalized and brought into action. Many were also afraid of being drafted. The first major action against the war was in 1965, initiated by staff members at the University of Michigan. They held a teach-in after class where interested students could meet with teachers to discuss the war. 3,000 students showed up and debated the war until 8 a.m. the next day, and this continued over the spring with teach-ins at over 100 universities. At Berkeley University, one of their teach-ins lasted 36 hours with 12,000 students in attendance at a time. There was a massive radicalization among students in around 65, and Students for the Democratic Society, which had 100,000 members, had called a protest in Washington. 25,000 people showed up. There was a distinct shift in consciousness happening, and quickly massive protests called by students sprung up across the country. Tens of thousands of people marched in coordinated actions. I think to understand the extent to which the student movement went, we need to understand the social and political context in the US at the time. The beginning of the war coincided with the explosion of the civil rights movement. Both the student movement and the wider anti-war movement were influenced by this struggle. Black and white people alike were becoming conscious of race discrimination and the role the governments had to play in that. The contradiction of the system in the US was becoming increasingly more stark. Many involved started off as middle class, expected America to deliver equality, but found that wasn't the case. And many drew the conclusion that the only way to win was through organizing and demonstration. Because of this, people were quite easily able to see that this was a racist war. Stokely Carmichael, who was a radical civil rights activist, characterized the war as white people sending black people to make war on yellow people in order to defend the land they stole from the red people. And Martin Luther King would slowly become more outspoken against the war, drawing parallels between the terror in Vietnam and the terror on black people at home in the US. And this was also in the context when a large majority of the conscripts were poor black men. King speaking up against the war had an impact, and in 1965, almost a quarter of the deaths in Vietnam were black men, but in 68, after King's speech, that went down to 13% and continued to decline. Generals were pulling black men out of combat rapidly. So yeah, the militant civil rights movement legitimized dissent for anti-war protesters and made people aware of the contradictions and injustices of the American system. People understood the violence against the Vietnamese people was the same violence against the black people at home. So yeah, by 1966, the anti-war sentiment ran deep into the society, and the ruling class was very scared. On the 20th of October that year, demonstrators claimed that they would march on the Pentagon. 35,000 did so, and they were met with a huge line of riot police. And in that year, the Pentagon tried to explain to Lyndon Johnson, who was the president at the time, that they could save lives by carpet bombing Hanoi and ending the war sooner. But in response, he said, "I have one more problem for your computer. How long would it take for 500,000 angry Americans to climb the White House walls and lynch their president if he does something like that?" And by 1966, it was clear that already 1 year into the mass of the protests, it was clear that the popular dissent was creating a crisis for the ruling class. And if the dissent wasn't already bad, in 1968, the Tet Offensive massively made things worse. The Viet Cong had tricked the Americans into expecting them to put their arms down during their New Year, and they set up a decoy battle with the North. They then moved into southern cities, attempting to liberate them from US control. Scenes of the US forces mercilessly killing civilians were broadcasted live to American homes, making it undeniable that the Vietnamese resistance was legitimate and that the US was the real aggressor, not the defenders of the peasants that they had claimed. And it also showed that they weren't winning. This made the war even more unpopular on the streets. And at the time, the capitalists were also souring on the war. There was full employment because of the boom, but they couldn't raise taxes to fund the war because it was so unpopular. So instead, people spent their money on foreign products. The ruling class was now having to balance the unrest on the streets with the pressure to keep the economy afloat. Massive riots were also breaking out around this time after the death of Martin Luther King. The ruling class needed to control America, but they couldn't. But under this pressure and fear of the fallout, Johnson refused the request from generals for 200 more troops to enter Vietnam. But yeah, the explosion of student movements in 68 came off the back of the Tet Offensive. People were seeing that the greatest power in the world could be defeated. And it put the ruling class in this contradiction where they wanted to end the war, but they didn't want to show that they could be defeated. And in 1969, which is the next election, Nixon had promised to end the war. But of course he didn't, and instead started bombing Cambodia and Laos. In response to this, 500,000 demonstrated in Washington. For 30 hours, people walked in single file lines holding signs with names of destroyed villages and Americans who had died. They were met by riot cops, gassed and beaten. But yeah, in April 69, Nixon announced that he would withdraw 150,000 troops. But also, in parallel to that, escalated the bombing of Indochina. So yeah, the ruling class was really in a crisis and scrambling, and that was reflected in the massive escalation of repression. At this point, student strikes and occupations broke out across colleges, and the most brutal situation was by students at Kent State University, where the National Guard opened fire on thousands of students, killing and injuring some. Students being shot wasn't something that had been seen before, and it had people outraged. And in response to this, 4,350,000 students protested on their campuses. Some even went on strike. There's a good example from Knoxville University, which is a predominantly black university, where almost the whole college, students, staff and administration voted unanimously to go on strike. And on a week's notice, 150,000 demonstrated in Washington. The crisis was growing, and Nixon announced that all American troops would be out of Cambodia by the end of June. The protests had worked. But yeah, the confidence of protests was in large part due to the legitimacy brought by the organised anti-war veterans. For many of them, they would have had no choice. They had to go to war because they were poor. They would get there, then they were faced by the horrors of the situation in Vietnam, and they would come home traumatised and injured. they'd come home to a system that could not provide for them. And as a result, they became very radicalized and viewed their experience as a question of class. They were forced by the generals above them to do things they didn't want to do at a war they didn't want to be at, and at home were forced into a system that couldn't meet their needs. So veterans started demonstrating and organizing. They started a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They put together a peace camp at the National Mall, and they ran it like an army camp. The government threatened force to make them leave, but they were ultimately bluffing. They knew the sight of removing disabled veterans would enrage people further. At another demonstration they held, 2,000 veterans marched on the Capitol dressed in old military uniform to return their medals to the Congress. They all went up to the fence of the police line and threw it over, and then threw their medals over, and they would have to say something as they did it. There's a couple good quotes. One was, "My name is Peter Brannigan. I got a Purple Heart, and I hope I get another one fighting these motherfuckers." And then another one was, "We're not going to fight anymore, but if we have to fight again, it will be to take those steps." So yeah, massive radicalization happening. And by the 70s, the movement had spread from the campuses to the barracks. Students were easy to organize, but workers were much harder, and the army was the hardest. Dissent within the army, is most significant because the apparatus that the ruling class uses to maintain its power will be destroyed. The ruling class needs the army to defend it from insurrection at home, and any dissent from armed services looks like mutiny, which threatens the whole rule of the rich over society. Their industrial might was also their whole ability to make war where the foundations of American power, where the foundations of American power in the world. Breaking the army takes the contradictions of the system being understood, and that ultimately took organization. The Socialist Workers' Party, which was a small Trotskyist group in the US at the time, had a policy of not refusing the draft. They would join and organize within. They had a paper with a print run of 15,000 and a mailing list of 3,000 in Vietnam. Joe Miles, a member, was drafted in '69 to Port Jackson and would organize other black soldiers to listen to speeches by Malcolm X. They started their own paper there. He started to get shipped around all the different bases because he was causing havoc, but the other soldiers there would restart the paper and keep it going. Many anti-war groups the organization was small, so many of the anti-war groups were organized by people propping up coffee houses near bases where they could discuss the war. And once the coffee houses got going, they would start their own papers. There were about 300 newspapers amongst the armed service during the war, and they started to prop up at bases all around the world. Same thing would happen. The men behind them would get shipped off and others would step in to replace them. So between 1968 and 75, 93,000 people ended up defecting from the army. The unrest amongst the veterans also inspired soldiers on the ground in Vietnam. They started to openly smoke weed and opium as a form of rebellion. They would draw peace symbols on their helmets and write FTA, which stood for Fuck the Army. And on the 4th of July 1971, 1,000 GIs in Vietnam went to the Chow Lay Beach to have a protest. But discontent grew, and GI started doing something called fragging, which is where they would throw fragmentation bombs at the tents of an officer that sent them on dangerous patrols. In many cases, no one was prosecuted because they would just lead to more fraggings. And in 1968 alone, there were 1,000 fraggings, and there came a point where there was so much dissent within the army that the officers started to have to negotiate with the soldiers. But there was also a situation where, the senior officers were very much remaining loyal to the court, but lieutenants and sergeants began to split in opposition to the war, which is kind of a symbol of the middle class becoming split. And in 1970, they even started their own anti-war group called Concerned Officers Movement. The Concerned Officers Movement. And by 71, it had 3,000 members. They also refused to fight in Vietnam. Many soldiers wore red armbands to signal to the Viet Cong that they didn't want to fight, and the generals that forced them out, and they would shoot the generals that forced them out. The NLF stated that they would not fire on units that did not fight on them. And then to top this off, ships were also refusing to sail soldiers over, and pilots were refusing to fly. The ruling class saw that there was no point in keeping troops in Vietnam at this point, and within 5 months, the number of soldiers went from 150,000 to 47,000, and the Americans were no longer winning the war. By Christmas, of 1972, the Vietnamese had shot down 35 American planes, and these were losses that the Air Force couldn't handle. So in 1973, Washington finally folded and signed a peace deal and shifted the last soldiers from Vietnam. Yeah. 15. Yeah, okay. To kind of conclude, I think this overall kind of shows that there is it is possible for wars to be ended through struggle, and shows the crucial roles that different sections of society play in that. Students, because of their ability to quickly radicalize and effectively organize, are often an inspiring starting off point for movements, but this can quickly spill across society as more people become alerted to the issue. Dissent within the army plays a major role in ending war, as it threatens the ruling class's ability to defend themselves, and altogether can culminate into a crisis that can actually break the ruling class agenda. In saying that, a flaw of the movement in the US was its inability to connect to the working class and have actual organised working class action. A lot of the students were a bit dismissive, believing that the working class were supportive of the war, but this was actually the opposite. A lot of them had gone to the war, come back, and told their families about it, and they made up the majority of the opposition. But that's in stark contrast to what happened in Australia, where we had the moratoriums, the stop work to stop the war, which ended up, putting massive pressure on the government, which made us be able to withdraw troops. I might end it there.